Welcome back to our channel, where we explore the darkest true stories that will haunt your dreams. Tonight, we're diving into a disturbing tale of terror, a true story of a night gone horribly wrong. This is not just a scary story. This is a real-life nightmare that happened to an unsuspecting individual. It was a cold October night when 27-year-old Jacob, a traveling salesman, found himself stranded on a desolate road miles away from the nearest town. His car had broken down in the middle of nowhere, and the only sign of life was an old, run-down gas station that seemed to have been forgotten by time. Desperate for help, Jacob decided to walk to the gas station, hoping to find someone who could assist him. As he entered, the place was empty, no cashier, no customers, just a faint buzzing sound of the flickering lights overhead. He called out, but there was no response. As he wandered through the aisles, he noticed something strange. Every item on the shelves was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if no one had touched them in years. Behind the counter, Jacob found an old journal, half hidden under a pile of newspapers. Flipping through it, he saw pages filled with frantic scribbles and disturbing sketches of figures with hollow eyes. One entry caught his attention. "They watch from the woods. Don't look at them. Don't let them in." As he read, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. There was something deeply unsettling about the place, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Jacob peered outside and saw faint figures moving between the trees, barely visible in the fog. He blinked, and they were gone, but the unsettling feeling remained. The journal's warnings echoed in his mind. Don't look at them. As Jacob backed away from the window, the gas station lights flickered and went out, plunging the place into darkness. Using his phone's flashlight, Jacob scanned the room, and that's when he saw a figure standing in the far corner, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. Jacob's heart raced as he realized the figure wasn't moving. It was just staring. He called out, but there was no response, only the faint, distorted sound of static echoing in the air. Overwhelmed with fear, Jacob ran out of the gas station and back toward the road. As he glanced back, he saw the figures from the woods now emerging, moving closer with each step. They weren't human. Their movements were disjointed, almost mechanical, as if they were puppets controlled by some unseen force. Jacob sprinted faster than he ever had, not daring to look back again until he reached his car. Jacob finally managed to start his car and sped away, the gas station and the figures fading into the rearview mirror. He never looked back, and he never took that route again. When he later tried to find the gas station on a map, it wasn't there. The place didn't exist, at least not anymore. But Jacob knew what he saw was real, and the memory of those hollow eyes still haunts him to this day. Story number 2. Eric was an urban explorer, someone who found thrill in exploring forgotten places, old factories, abandoned hospitals, and ghost towns long left to decay. On this particular evening, he was on his way to investigate an old apartment complex that had been vacant for years. Local rumors said it was haunted, but Eric didn't believe in ghosts. He was just there for the adventure. The complex was massive, 6 floors of crumbling walls, shattered windows, and endless dark corridors. As Eric made his way inside, the building creaked and groaned, the sound of age and neglect echoing in the cold air. But as Eric ventured deeper, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. In one of the rooms, Eric found something strange. Symbols scrawled on the walls in red paint, along with old, faded photographs of random people. Most were blurry, taken at odd angles, and none of them made sense. But one photo caught his eye. It was a picture of him, taken just moments before he entered the building. Eric's blood ran cold. He was sure he had been alone. He continued down the hallway, flashlight in hand, when he saw a figure standing at the end of the hall, motionless. It was too dark to make out any details, but the outline was unmistakable. Eric called out, thinking it might be another explorer, but the figure didn't move. Instead, it just stood there, as if waiting. Panic set in as the figure suddenly bolted toward him. Eric turned and ran, heart pounding, the sound of footsteps thundering behind him. No matter how fast he ran, the footsteps were always just a few paces behind, relentless and unnerving. Every door he passed seemed to slam shut on its own, as if the building itself was trying to trap him. Eric finally found an exit, bursting out of the building and collapsing on the cold, wet ground outside. As he looked back, he saw the figure standing in the doorway, watching him silently before slowly retreating back into the darkness. Eric never went exploring alone again, and he never spoke of what happened in that building until now. Later, that night, Eric reviewed the footage from his camera, hoping to make sense of what he'd seen. But what he found was far worse: frames of shadowy figures lurking behind him in almost every shot, distorted faces staring back at him from the walls. They had been watching him long before he ever saw them. It wasn't just one figure. It was many, hidden in the shadows, silently observing. Story number 3. Eric's story is a chilling reminder that some places are best left undisturbed. The shadows of the past linger, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to seek them out. If you ever find yourself drawn to an abandoned place, remember, you may not be as alone as you think. As he drove, Alex noticed something strange: a figure standing on the side of the road, barely visible in the dim light of his headlights. It was just for a split second, but it was enough to unsettle him. Alex slowed down, thinking it might be someone in need of help, but when he looked again, the figure was gone. Shrugging it off as a trick of the light, he continued driving. But just a few miles down the road, Alex saw it again: the same figure, this time closer. It looked like a person, but something was off. It was too tall, its limbs too long, and it moved in a way that wasn't quite right. As Alex glanced in his rearview mirror, the figure appeared briefly behind his car, then disappeared, leaving him feeling cold and unnerved. A few minutes later, Alex noticed an old car behind him, its headlights off. The car seemed to come out of nowhere, following him closely without attempting to pass. Alex sped up, but the car matched his speed, its dark silhouette barely visible in his mirrors. He couldn't see who was driving, but he could feel the eyes on him. Alex's anxiety turned to fear as the car behind him began to swerve, getting dangerously close as if trying to force him off the road. He slammed on the gas, heart pounding, as the car continued to tailgate him aggressively. With no other vehicles in sight and no cell service, he felt trapped on a never-ending road. Desperate, Alex spotted an old gas station up ahead, a faint glimmer of hope in the darkness. He pulled over, hoping to lose the car or find someone to help. But as he glanced back, the car was gone. There were no skid marks, no sound of an engine fading into the distance, just empty road. The gas station, too, seemed deserted, with nothing but a flickering light inside. As Alex approached, he looked inside the gas station's window, and there it was, the figure, standing at the counter, staring directly at him. Its face was blurred, its eyes dark and sunken, and it was wearing the same clothes as the driver he had seen in the old car. Alex stumbled back in horror, heart racing, as the lights inside flickered and the figure vanished into thin air. Panicked, Alex ran back to his car and drove off, not stopping until he was miles away. He didn't know what he had seen that night, but he knew it wasn't human. The road ahead seemed longer than it ever had, and every shadow felt like it was creeping closer. He never drove that route again, and he never spoke of that night until now. Some roads are haunted, not by ghosts, but by memories and echoes of things that should never be seen. If you ever find yourself on an empty highway late at night, keep your eyes on the road and your doors locked. You never know who or what might be following. Story number 4. Sarah was a nurse working the night shift at a small, quiet hospital. It was her first week on the job, and she was still getting used to the eerie silence that came with working nights. There were fewer staff, fewer patients, and the long, dimly lit hallways felt like something out of a horror movie. But Sarah was determined to make it through the shift, no matter how unsettling the atmosphere. During her rounds, Sarah noticed something odd. a patient chart on the door of room 303. The room was supposed to be empty, undergoing repairs after a recent flood. Curious, Sarah peered inside, only to find an elderly woman lying in the bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. The woman's eyes were wide open, and she seemed completely still, almost as if she were frozen in place. Startled, Sarah quickly checked the woman's vitals, but they were weak, barely registering. She turned away to call for assistance, but when she looked back, the bed was empty. The woman was gone, and the sheets were perfectly folded, as if no one had ever been there. Sarah's heart raced as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Had she imagined it? Still shaken, Sarah asked a fellow nurse about room 303, hoping for some clarity. The nurse hesitated before speaking. That room ... It's been empty for years. No one's supposed to go in there. She went on to explain that the room had a dark history. Years ago, a patient had died under mysterious circumstances, and ever since, strange occurrences have plagued the room. Lights flickering, objects moving on their own, and patients who reported seeing someone watching them. As the night went on, the unsettling feeling only grew. Sarah could hear faint whispers echoing through the hallways, calling her name. Lights flickered above her, and the temperature dropped suddenly, leaving her breath visible in the cold air. It was as if the hospital itself was alive, watching her every move. Passing by room 303 again, Sarah heard the sound of labored breathing coming from inside. Against her better judgment, she pushed the door open. The elderly woman was back, lying in the same position, eyes still fixed on the ceiling. But this time, Sarah noticed something she hadn't before. The woman's wrist was bandaged, with a hospital tag that read a date from over 30 years ago. The woman looked directly at Sarah, her eyes full of sorrow, and whispered, "Help me." Sarah bolted out of the room, but the hallway seemed longer, distorted. No matter how fast she ran, the exit kept moving further away. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her, slow, shuffling, and growing closer. She turned, and there they were, the ghostly figures of past patients, standing in the hallway, their eyes empty and faces twisted in silent screams. Sarah never worked the night shift again. The hospital confirmed that room 303 had been sealed off for years, and there were no records of any elderly patients that matched the description of the woman she saw. But Sarah knew what she had witnessed was real, a haunting reminder of the lives that linger in the places we least expect. Sometimes, the most unsettling hauntings don't happen in old houses or graveyards. They happen in places meant to heal, where the spirits of the past still roam the halls, waiting for someone to see them. If you ever feel a cold breeze or hear whispers on a quiet night shift, remember, you may not be as alone as you think.